Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, Approaching Employers as a Disabled Student. My name is Dealey Goodwin and I'm the Careers Consultant here at the University of Manchester with a specialism in disability. And this is my co-presenter, Cindy McAllister, who I'll introduce you to shortly. Hello, Cindy.
Hi.
Yeah, so I offer 60-minute appointments along with my colleague at the university, my colleague Vic Geary, for any students or graduates with a disability or long-term health condition or mental health condition. So I advise on a range of issues such as disclosure, reasonable adjustments, and finding disability positive employers. We also link with a number of partner organisations who offer internships and graduate opportunities. So I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Cindy McAllister, who works for one of our partner organisations called Employability. So Cindy, if you want to say hello.
Thanks, Delia. Just checking you can hear me because I've been having some issues with my audio. Is that okay now?
Yes, excellent. We can hear you.
Great. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Cindy McAllister. So I work for Employability. We are a not-for-profit organisation. We've been around since 2006. And essentially what we do is we support students and graduates into employment if they have a disability or a neurodiverse condition. Disability covers a wide range of conditions which you may not be aware of. So, for example, mental health conditions, long-term health conditions, as well as the more classic perceptions of disability. So our services to you are completely free, and we're really here to help you. So you'll hear me speak, but any questions you may have afterwards, please feel free to contact me to kind of ask anything at all. We're here for you. We're here to help you into employment, and we're here and we partner with the Careers Service, and we kind of work together with them. So that's us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we'd like to welcome you all today, and we hope really that our aim is that by the end of the session you'll feel more equipped to approach interactions with employers and to make well-informed job applications and to make those with confidence. That is our aim today. So really hope that by the end of the session you'll feel more informed and more confident. So here's the overview of what we're covering today. I'm just going to turn my camera off now so that I can access the slides more easily. So I shall do that. Okay, so we've already introduced ourselves, so I don't need to do that again. So yeah, here's the overview of what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to take a look first at the kinds of concerns and questions that you may have, and offer you the opportunity via the question box to put your own questions to us. So you'll see the question box there. My colleague Jenny, who's a co-organiser, is going to be keeping an eye on the questions for us, so that when we get some time at the end, if we've not answered your questions during the course of the presentation, then we'll absolutely do our utmost to answer them in the last 15 to 20 minutes. So first of all, we're going to be focusing a lot on your rights under the Equality Act 2010, so that you're fully aware of your legal position. And we hope that this will help you to be clear on what you're entitled to access during any recruitment process that you might enter into. We're also going to cover disclosure, big topic, and reasonable adjustments, another big topic, and provide you with some examples of what they might mean in practice, well, what they do mean in practice. And then Cindy's going to talk you through how you can present yourself in a clear and a positive way, and provide you some instances of when and how you can do this. And then finally, we'll show you some vacancy and information sources and give you the time over to you for your own questions, and my colleague Jenny, as I said, will be looking out for these. Okay, so these are just some examples of the types of questions that we've been asked in the past. Obviously you will have your own too, and as I've said already, you can use your questions tab to post your own, and we'll devote time to that. But yeah, the big one, when and how shall I disclose? So there's lots of different places in the recruitment process and in the workplace as well that you can disclose, because obviously some people will develop a condition or develop a disability while actually in the workplace. If I disclose, what kind of support can I expect in the recruitment process? Well, the short answer to that is, that you can expect what you need. You'll all have your own individual needs and requirements, so we'll be covering that. I know a lot of people worry about discrimination and what happens if you feel that you're being discriminated against. So, as I say, we're going to be covering in some detail the Equality Act, and I know Cindy has got a lot of examples around that, and I'm sure that we both can take questions about that. This is a very, very common one. So having a specific learning difficulty such as dyslexia, and I can't actually finish assessment tests even if I have extra time. So what can I do? So again, it's about requesting alternative formats. But again, we can talk through that shortly. Mental health conditions, very common. Anxiety, depression, amongst other mental health conditions. There's a lot of anxiety out there about this issue. So again, we will be covering that. Having conversations either in person or virtually. So obviously at the moment it's all virtual. Some of you will be going to the fairs next week. They're all virtual. Some of you may well have attended our Prepare for the Fair webinar yesterday. So yeah, it's different in person, and the dynamics are different in person than they are virtually. But I think it's really about being as prepared as you possibly can, and having your script, your phrases that you have crafted with advice from us if you need that, and they're your adjustments that you're going to be asking for. So they need to be written in a way and spoken in a way that you feel happy with. One of the questions that I get a lot actually in my role is students who very often perhaps have had to take time out because of their disability or health condition, and that sometimes can cause gaps in their CV. So if that applies to anybody here, then please do post a question about that. Okay, so this is the law now. So it defines, the Equality Act 2010 defines disability as a physical or a mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term diverse effect on the person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So as Cindy said, there are numerous examples of this massive range of conditions, from specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia through to mental illness, anxiety and depression, long-term health conditions, for example, things like Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, neurodiverse candidates, so those that are on the autism spectrum, and also other conditions, specifically neurological conditions such as MS, and diagnosis of cancer is also classed as a disability. So what constitutes a disability then? Well, the Act states that it's something that's more than minor or trivial. So, for example, if it takes a lot longer than it usually would to complete a daily task, such as getting dressed. And again, there are special rules for fluctuating or recurring conditions. I've already mentioned MS and I've mentioned cancer, but also HIV, for example, is protected from the point of diagnosis. So when a person meets this definition, employers, and this is really important that you know this if you're not already aware, and as I say, we really are very focused today on what your rights are and what you are entitled to. So employers, the onus is on them. They are required to make reasonable adjustments to any element of the job which would place you as a disabled person at a disadvantage compared to a non-disabled person. So what we're trying to do is to address that disadvantage and level the playing field. And you may have heard that phrase bandied around, but that certainly is one that Cindy and myself and and other colleagues working with disabled candidates they're very, very keen to promote. So this duty for the employers to make those reasonable adjustments can arise, obviously, of course, during the recruitment process. So from advertising the job through to selection, and also once the employee starts work. And it can also arise if an employee, as I mentioned before, perhaps becomes disabled during their employment. So the Equality Act 2010, know your rights, as I said before. So the physical features of the work premises or the working arrangements are the prohibiting factor. And apologies again for the legalese, but it's useful to know the exact words. To a disabled person gaining or staying in employment, then the employer must make reasonable adjustments to remove those barriers. And again, just to reiterate, it's your right to a level playing field at every stage. It's important to note here that it's not anticipatory. So an employer doesn't know unless you tell them. So the adjustments can only be made from the point of disclosure, which is why considering when to disclose your condition or conditions, why that's so important. So what's reasonable then? So these are some examples of what may be a suitable adjustment for a particular candidate. So there's quite a wide range on that list. It could be adjustments to the actual processes. So for example, extra time for assessments or large print. In the workplace, it could be flexible hours. So again, going back to the people with a mental health diagnosis, sometimes flexible hours can work really, really well. Working from home can work really, really well. I know that's what most of us are, unfortunately doing at the moment. But that's definitely something that is something to be asked for and to be requested if that would help that individual to perform to the best of their ability. So specialist software or modified equipment. So for example, standing desks can be provided for people with back conditions. Quiet workspaces, again, that can be a very useful aspect of an environment if somebody is neurodiverse, so somebody with perhaps sensory concerns and issues can request a quiet workspace. And again, things like time off for appointments. So yeah, I mean, remember this isn't an exhaustive list. It's not a menu. These are just examples. So your adjustments will be unique to you and personal to you. If you already have a DAS support plan, which I know many of you will have, then that can be a good starting point or guide. Because I say it's about what you require, not what you think might be available. So although it's not anticipatory, the duty on the employer, the Act only requires to make employers, for employers to make adjustments that are reasonable in all the circumstances. So things like taking into account cost and practicability of the adjustment. Obviously that can be something that can be discussed, and I know that's something that we can talk about later as well. So if things do go wrong, as we know that they do, an employment tribunal can decide what is reasonable, and it's important to note, as on the next slide, that a failure to make reasonable adjustments is discrimination, but the only sort of forum for whether this can be formally decided is at a tribunal. There's also Section 60 on the Equality Act, which essentially is a ban on asking disability or health-related questions in the recruitment process. So recruiters can only ask if you need adjustments, not whether you have a disability, not any questions are related to that. So that is strictly prohibited and would be deemed to be discriminatory. But an employer can ask questions after an offer has been made. However, obviously, they still can't discriminate. There are some exceptions to Section 60, but Cindy will go into more detail on these shortly. Okay, so how and when do I disclose then if I have a health condition or a disability? So it's important to note that this is highly personal and highly individual, and Cindy and I have worked on with disabled applicants for many years, and we've had numerous different conversations with different people over the years, where you really have to look in some depth at what the factors are for that individual. So it can take time to work through and come to a decision that you're comfortable about. And then, of course, there are pros and cons. You might not want to be defined by a disability, or you might not see it as a disability at all. You might think it doesn't affect your ability to do the job, so why draw attention to it? Or you might have heard negative stories about attitudes to applicants disclosing. But it's worth bearing in mind that you are entitled under the law, and that many employers are very committed to recruiting disabled applicants as they're seeking a diverse workforce. And very importantly, you might also be able to take the opportunity to describe your disability or health condition in a positive light. So, for example, providing examples of competencies that employers seek, such as problem solving or overcoming obstacles. So Cindy will take you through some instances of when and how to disclose in more detail shortly. But as I say, there's no right or wrong answers to this. It is a highly individual decision. Okay, so moving quickly on now, I've got some examples here of statements that people have made in the past to employers. So there's one here on autism. So this is a condition that affects the way I communicate and interact with others. It means I have challenges, also means I have strengths in certain areas, and these are multiple sclerosis. In the workplace, there are some simple adjustments that would be helpful. So these are, they, for example, could be rest breaks. And then dyslexia, as we've already said, means that you can be granted 25% extra time in examinations. So what next? So you know your rights now, so that's good. So what's the next step? So yeah, some bullet points that Cindy and I have discussed in planning this webinar, that we both use and that we would both advocate. So ask about the process. Remember that it is your legal right. Research the employer, and we're going to be talking in a bit more detail about that towards the end. Use resources and advice available, and be confident, be positive. You've got nothing to apologise for, absolutely nothing to apologise for, so don't be apologetic. Be upfront, keep to the facts. It just needs to be a very simple request. It's not a heart-to-heart with a recruiter, it's just a frank conversation about your needs. So Cindy will take you through some examples of where, when and how to make approaches and ask questions about the recruitment process on the workplace, and focus on it's your opportunity to do some positive self-marketing and focus on what you can do instead of what you have difficulty with.
Okay. Thank you so much, Delia. And the first thing I should say here possibly is that there's a risk of some degree of repetition in what I'm saying, but some of these points are very important to repeat so that you really bear them in mind. And the first of these, I would say, is that any decision you make should be made bearing in mind the background and the context of your legal rights. So I have a background in law. I was a lawyer, and so I'm particularly concerned with this, but I'm particularly concerned how that translates into your protection and into your privacy and choice. So we talk a lot at employability because we're very concerned about empowerment, and the underlying piece to that, I suppose, is privacy and choice. So information about your disability is really, I suppose, it's the most private type of information we can have. Health information is incredibly sensitive and it's incredibly personal. So the point, I suppose, that underlies everything in terms of a kind of practical approach to how you go about applying for work is that this is your choice. Okay, should you wish to discuss your disability during the recruitment process, then that is your choice. Should you prefer not to, that too is your choice. Now, for whatever reason, you may, for example, be afraid that you will experience discrimination during the recruitment process and not get the job if you talk about your health condition or your disability. Or, for example, with mental health conditions, talking about the disability itself may exacerbate that condition. So you may feel that that's not appropriate or right for you. On the flip side of that, right at the other extreme, you may feel that your disability is an intrinsic part of who you are, and that it's really something you want to talk about upfront during the recruitment process, and that that's important to you. And whichever category you fall into, the point is that the Equality Act is there so that you can exercise this choice. So with some very limited exceptions, which I'm going to come to in a moment, as Delia has already said, potential employers are not allowed to ask you any questions whatsoever about your disability or health condition during the recruitment process. So what this means is if you don't want to speak about your disability, you don't have to. But if you do, you can. So what I always say to students is treat the legislation as your ally. Be aware of the protections it affords and use it as you see fit. It's really there as your friend, and it is really there to put you in control. Now, having said that, what we see day to day on the ground, the reality of this is that many employers aren't aware of the legislation. And you should expect, particularly if you're applying to a large number of organisations, to be asked questions about your disability during the recruitment process, despite the fact that in fact that is illegal. So from a practical perspective, for your peace of mind, so that you don't get wrong-footed, be prepared in advance to answer those questions. Again, it may be that you feel comfortable answering them, but if you don't, have an answer prepared in advance, very polite, very firm, where you say something like, I'm not comfortable answering this, I'm aware that I don't have to, I'll be happy to talk about my disability at a later date, or I won't. But whatever answer it is that you feel that is appropriate for you, be prepared in advance. That is something that we at Employability can help you with. So if you feel that you find yourself in a situation in an interview, for example, where you were asked something that you believe is contrary to the legislation, but you feel a little bit awkward and you're worried about the answer you gave, then we can pick up the phone and we can chat to that organisation on your behalf, and we can help them and we can explain the law. We have a great deal of experience doing that, and actually we find that for the most part it's pretty well received. Because organisations who don't know the law, and are asking these questions are usually doing it through no fault of their own, in fact. So with that backdrop, and always bearing all of that in mind, because your rights really provide the kind of groundwork for the rest of it, moving on to the sort of practicalities of the thing. So the first question you want to ask yourself in the recruitment process, or indeed generally, is when is the right time for me to be talking about my disability? So a really important point is that there is no general answer to this, because it depends on the job itself. Okay, so what we say is inform yourself about the particular recruitment process of that particular job. Inform yourself about the academic and experiential requirements of that particular job. Do that in as much detail as possible, in whichever way you can. Have a look at their website, speak to anybody who you know who may have worked there, reach out, really do your homework and try to understand as much as possible. And based on that, you should make an assessment about whether, and if so, when, to mention your disability. So it may be that you choose to speak about your disability at the initial application stage. And now there are three reasons really why you may wish to do that. Three situations, if you like. The first is if you don't have the grades or the work experience that are required really to access that role. So, for example, some firms require at least a 2-1 in all end-of-year exams, and it may be that you don't have that because of the impact of your disability. So you may wish to explain that on an application. So, for example, you may wish to say whatever is the truth of the situation. But if you had to attend medical appointments, you were in hospital, or if you received a late stage diagnosis, whatever the situation may be, if those grades were impacted and you did not meet the kind of minimum requirements as a result of your disability, then now the initial application stage, is the time to talk about that, because that will generally allow you to move on to the next stage, to allow your application to even be considered. And to be clear, you can do this without necessarily mentioning what your disability is. It may be sufficient to say, I have a disability and therefore, without saying what it is. So the second reason, I suppose, why you may want to be talking about disability at this stage is because some roles require actually you to have a disability as a qualification for the job. So examples of that might include for working for a disability charity, as I do, or as a diversity officer, whether in a university or in a company. And of course, sort of by definition, you would need to mention it at the application stage. And I suppose the final piece to this is there are positive action schemes, which mean that if you have a disability, you can skip some elements of the recruitment process, for example, go straight to the interview stage, but you will be required to confirm that you have a disability in order to access that. Okay, so those are the reasons really why you might be wanting to disclose at this very early stage. Next, I suppose, is the body of the recruitment process. So whether it's test stage, assessment centre stage, or interview. Now, so Delia has touched upon some of the specific adjustments that might be relevant during these stages, but I suppose the point that really is important to make is that for every single individual and for every single disability, the way in which your disability impacts you and the way the adjustments you may therefore need at each one of these stages is entirely individual. I mean, it's really a question of how long is a piece of string. So there isn't much point really in me going into great depth at this stage right now on a webinar about the adjustments you may need, but please do feel free to contact me afterwards, and I can either advise you on that, or I can put one of my colleagues who's a consultant as to adjustments on the case and really help you understand what you need. What I want to say here is that there are two real reasons why you would be raising disability at this point. The first is that you may wish to use that in a positive way, really to add impact to your application, because disability really, and for those of us who live with a disability, understanding that getting to university, overcoming these hurdles really is something that, you know, it's an amazing selling point. So that may be something that you wish to raise. And the second reason you may want to be talking about this is because you need adjustments during the recruitment process, so at the test, assessment centre or interview stage. You know, it's incredibly important that if you need those, you don't worry about it and that you ask for them. So sort of within that, there are a few points that are important to bear in mind. So the first is to ask well in advance. Okay, so again and again, not with the employers we work with, but with those who aren't necessarily as aware of the law or kind of as up on disability issues. Students asking for adjustments, you know, if they ask a couple of days in advance and then, you know, it's turned down, we don't have the time to negotiate that properly or educate the employer about what they're required to give. But if the request is made with plenty of time in advance, then we do have that, and generally the adjustment tends to be made. So ask well in advance for what you need for any particular stage of the recruitment process. Next, please bear in mind that an employer cannot tell you that they don't offer a certain type of adjustment. So, you know, Regularly, again, not our employer partners, but we have queries from students saying, well, you know, I applied to this job and they said, well, they only offer 15% extra time. They can't do that. You are entitled to ask for whatever it is you need, and the employer is required to give that to you as long as it is reasonable. Now, reasonable is a legal test, as Delia has said. Only an employment tribunal can decide that. But the piece to remember is that they are not allowed to give you a prescriptive list of what they do and don't offer, and you need to know that. And this ties back into understanding your rights. Again, should you face a situation like that where an employer tells you, I'm sorry, we can't offer that, or here's the list of things we offer, please pick up the phone, please drop us an email, and we can carry that conversation forward on your behalf so that you are given the level playing field, which is your right. Okay. Third, please bear in mind that the adjustments you have in education are not necessarily going to be the same ones you need for the recruitment process. So I'm just kind of sticking with the same example for the sake of ease, really. But if you have 25% extra time on university exams, or had that on school exams, or what have you, there's no reason why that automatically transfers to assessment centre tests. They're very different. They are qualitatively different. And there's no real link between the two. Yeah. And so it's really important to understand what you would need as an adjustment. So with a degree of regularity, we ask for significantly more extra time, for example, or for some of our candidates, we ask that they aren't required to sit that test at all because they can't, for example. And invariably, this is accepted by the employer once we've entered negotiations. So, but don't assume that what you're used to is what you'll need going forward in the recruitment process. It's different. There's no reason for you to know that, obviously, because you haven't been through the recruitment process probably before, and that's fine. But so bear that in mind. Again, feel free to have a conversation with us and we can help you with that. And the final point I would make in terms of this really is around interviews. So adjustments come in all shapes and sizes, and really it's whatever you need. And it may be that during an interview you require what we call an attitudinal adjustment, which means that the interviewer is required to alter their perception. And this raises its head very often in the context of neurodiverse conditions. So to give you an example, somebody on the autistic spectrum may have an atypical way of communicating. One element of that might be that they have difficulty making eye contact, for example. Now, an interviewer in ordinary circumstances might assume that that means that the person is bored. If armed with the knowledge that that should not be interpreted in that way and not taken into account in that way, then that is an adjustment. So if, for example, you're on the autistic spectrum and you don't want any differences in the way you communicate to be taken into account or held against you, then that's something that you are entitled to raise, and it's something that they must give you, in fact. Once again, we're happy to help you negotiate that, because I realise that can be pretty difficult. It may be that you decide to talk about disability after you've received an offer. Again, as Delia mentioned, this is a bit of a different stage. At that point, employers are entitled to ask you questions about your disability. Okay, the law changes, the rules change. Now, the rules change because at that point, it's sort of easier to prove discrimination. So if you're given a job offer, then you raise disability, and then that job offer is withdrawn, that's a much easier case to prove, really. So employers are far less likely to engage in any discriminatory acts at that point. So that's something to bear in mind. It may be that you have chosen not to mention your disability at all during the recruitment process because you didn't feel you needed any adjustments during the recruitment process, but you feel you might need them in order to do the job, and so therefore this is the right moment to raise it. Or it may be that you've mentioned adjustments during the recruitment process but not told the employer what your disability is, not gone into it in any depth, and that's fine. but you may feel that in order to do your job adequately and to ensure that you have a supportive environment, then now you need to talk a bit more about it and ensure that your managers understand the impact, receive the training, or what have you. So there are different reasons why that might be the appropriate moment to kind of enter into this discussion. And then finally, as to the when, once you're in work, it may be that you didn't realize you needed any adjustments until you got into the role, and now it's apparent that you do. It may simply be that you didn't want to talk about it beforehand because you were worried about discrimination. It may be equally that the fact of doing the work itself has exacerbated symptoms, for example, with a mental health condition, and that has created the need for adjustments. So this is all fine. You can ask for adjustments at any point. And one thing I hear again and again is, well, if I don't mention it during the recruitment process, then it's a bit unfair. I'll feel as though I have sort of hoodwinked the employer into giving me this position and that I mustn't mention it afterwards. I'm going to urge you not to think like that. The adjustments are your right. Talking about your disability at any point whatsoever, when you choose, when you are comfortable, that is your right. And those adjustments are provided to you, and any support for your disability is provided to you as a matter of right and as a matter of law. And you haven't hoodwinked anybody into anything whatsoever. The other important piece to remember is that once you're in work, the range of adjustments that you can ask for is incredibly extensive. You'd probably be incredibly surprised actually by what you can ask for. And the legal protections afforded to you are really extensive. So really, please don't worry if you find yourself in a situation where you ask once you're in work. It's really fine. It's really very much not a problem. Do not worry about whether an adjustment that you ask for is or is not reasonable. That is the employer's problem. Ask for what you need. You'll almost certainly get it, but from a legal perspective and from an emotional perspective, ask for what you need. So moving on to the why. So we've mentioned, both Julie and I have mentioned, the ban on asking questions about disability and health during the recruitment process, and that's a pretty general ban. And there are 4 exceptions to this. There are 4 situations in which an employer is allowed to ask you questions of that type. The first is adjustments. So they can say, do you require any adjustment during the recruitment process? They can't ask you about the disability that underlies that or requires it. They can just ask about the adjustment. The second is that they can ask if you are able to do an intrinsic function of the job. If you have a disability which prevents you from doing an intrinsic function of the job. Now, for most of you, you will never hear this question because it tends to raise its head in the context of roles which have a physical aspect to them. But in any event, the question will usually end there. Okay, and if you can then say, yes, but I can do this with reasonable adjustments in place, then that's fine. The conversation ends there. And then the following 2, the other 2 exceptions are if you're applying for a role via a positive action scheme, which we've already touched upon, or if disability is a qualification for the job, which again, we've already touched upon. So those are the situations in which you might be asked a question. So moving on to why you may wish to raise this. Again, so we've touched already upon adding impact to your application, but I'd like to go into this very briefly in a little bit more detail. So it can be very powerful in terms of competency questions or displaying skills to use disability, if you feel that you're comfortable with that, to show that this is something that sets you apart. Okay, so for example, you may wish to use your disability to demonstrate a strategy that you have developed to face challenges. And this in particular is one of the key traits that employers these days are looking for. And so, yes, in a sense, you have a great kind of tool up your sleeve with this if you're comfortable talking about it. What I would say here is that the same advice that we would give answering competency questions with any kind of answer is be incredibly specific. Okay, so don't just say, for example, I have developed strategies to deal with my dyslexia. Okay, it's just not enough information. Okay, so you need, as with answering all competency questions, to be really specific. Show them how that's the case, why that's the case. It doesn't have to relate, no answers to competency questions have to relate to work experience or professional experience, but they really do have to be specific. So for example, you may wish to say something like, because of my dyslexia, I type lecture notes. This has meant that I am now a proficient typist, and I have a ready set of notes which I can, manipulate easily into different essay types, and this has allowed me to share my notes with others whenever we have group projects or whatever. But the point being, be specific. And you can in fact be specific without mentioning the disability itself if you wish. It's challenging, but you can do that. The next reason you might wish to be raising this is to explain a profile difference. And again, we've touched on this. It's the issue of not necessarily having the grades that are required, the experience that's required, or perhaps because it took you longer to finish your degree, or it may take you longer. The point about this I'd like to make here is that you are raising this in order to prevent discrimination. And what you're actually asking for when you're describing this is an adjustment of perception, which is your right. You're asking the employer to look at things differently, and that in and of itself is an adjustment. And it's incredibly important that you remember this and that you don't feel that you're a fraud or making excuses. And this is really something I hear again and again when talking to students. Do not be apologetic. This is your right. You were given your disability, and you're not going to apologize for it. You're asking for this perception to be different because that's your right to ask for it. And the approach should be, despite these hurdles for which I was not provided with adequate and timely adjustments, I have still succeeded in education. And the truth is that you have. You're at Manchester University, so therefore this is a fact. So be confident in presenting this and expecting this change of perception. And the final point is assessing the employer. Well, they are assessing you, that's for sure, okay? But you're also assessing them, and this is your chance to do that. So really ask yourself, is this the sort of place I want to work? And you probably want to be thinking, do I believe they have a genuine culture of inclusivity? And talking about your condition is really an excellent way to explore this. So remember, yes, they can't ask you any questions about your disability, but there is absolutely nothing stopping you from asking them. So this is your moment to assess them. So finally, moving on to the how. Well, positively, confidently, unapologetically. We've already touched upon this, as has Delia, because we can't touch upon it enough. You have the right to ask for what you need. You mustn't feel guilty. You are not an imposter. The employer is not doing you a favour, either by providing adjustments or indeed eventually, if you're successful, by hiring you. Don't worry about whether an adjustment is reasonable. Just go ahead and ask for it. Again, provide concrete examples. I've just talked about this, but if you are going to reference your disability, make sure you do it in a way which is very, very specific. Always provide concrete examples. Inform the employer. These are human beings, okay? So they may be naive, they may lack knowledge, they may lack experience, or indeed they may work from stereotypes. Give them the chance to give you what you need. Sometimes recruiters think they know what a person needs because they have come across the same disability before, and you may have to explain to them that everyone's disability impacts them differently and that this is what you need. Similarly, don't make assumptions. You shouldn't assume that recruiters know what you need. They may never have come across your condition or disability before. but also they may simply lack confidence dealing with disability generally, or they may be, inexperienced in work. So don't ever make any assumptions. And finally, employability is here. Please use us. If you don't feel that you wish to discuss with an employer the adjustments you need for recruitment, or if you're successful, the adjustments you may need in the workplace, then we can do that for you. That's what we're here for. We will have a confidential discussion with you about your disability and how it impacts you in particular, and we can then advise you on the adjustments that you're likely to need during the recruitment process, or indeed in the workplace, for that particular role. And we will speak to the employer on your behalf. We'll ensure that we have a full and detailed understanding of their recruitment process. So this is true even if this is not somebody that we work with. We will help you do this with any employer. And based on this, we'll tell them the adjustments you require. And to be very honest, we're not going to take no for an answer. And also, to be very honest, they're generally not going to challenge us too much, because we have many years of experience and we have a certain reputation in the market, and so they generally will accept what we ask for. So if you're not comfortable doing this yourself, come to us. As I've said, it's completely free. Our advice is free. If you speak to us and then decide you prefer to do it yourself, that's also completely fine. In any event, we won't be telling an employer what your disability is. We'll be discussing that with you, and anything going forward is confidential. As I've said, it's all completely free. If you're interested in that, please do take a look at our website and the services we offer, and have a think about how we can support you. And again, just to reiterate, if you have any questions about that, please feel free to drop me a line afterwards or at any point going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for that really amazingly comprehensive overview of what the issues are really. Sorry, I'm just having some problems with my slides, so if you just bear with me. While I'm doing that, I have spotted a couple of questions around whether the notes will be made available. Jenny, could you perhaps explain what will happen about the handouts after the event?
Yeah, sure. So you should be able to, anyone that has accessed the recording should be able to download the handouts afterwards. But if not, feel free to just drop us an email on careers.info@manchester.ac.uk and we'll send around the handouts as well.
Thank you for that, Jenny. Just conscious of time, I have got a few more slides that I can go through, but I just wanted to make sure that we have got the opportunity to answer any questions that may have come through. I've got a limited view of these. I'm just wondering whether, Jenny, you could perhaps go through any questions that are on the chat.
Yeah, sure. So we haven't received any questions yet, but I know it sometimes takes a lot of time because you've sort of consumed a lot of information. So please feel free to use the question and answer box if you have any questions for either Delia or Cindy. Okay, so there are a couple of questions come through. Sorry. Okay, so what if someone has been not yet diagnosed, but they're waiting on they're actively seeking a diagnosis, but because of the length of the waiting list and things, they have been applying for guaranteed interviews under the Disability Confidence Scheme, but they're worried that they're not eligible to. Does yourself, Delia, or Cindy have any sort of tips or information if this is the case for someone?
Hi. Oh, sorry. Cindy, do you want to go ahead?
Well, for the Disability Confidence Scheme, I'm not aware of the technical details of that as to whether they require a diagnosis or not. From a practical perspective, I would suggest that you tick the box and then explain. I don't know if you agree with that, Delia. From our perspective, we don't require any official diagnosis in order to support you. So we will support you. Obviously, it's the Disability Confidence Scheme. We some of those employers are also our partner employers. So there are different ways of applying for the same role. and applying through us is one, but we certainly will support you irrespective. Do you have any idea about the technicalities of that, Delia?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, the question is not the diagnosis, but your needs. So it's really about ensuring that your needs are met. It could be that later on in the process, after an offer potentially has been made, that you may be maybe put forward for an occupational health assessment, in which case that would take place. And if the diagnosis is ready by then, that can form part of any discussions between yourself and the employer. But you know, there's no onus on you to speed up. You can't speed up that process. But what you can do is ensure that you're making the requests for your needs.
Great, thank you. There's two more questions that have come through. Actually, sorry, a couple of them. So the first one is, how do you communicate gaps in your CV where a mental health condition has meant that you're leaving jobs? I don't know if either of you had any advice on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some experience of this with students over the years, and I just want to return to the point that Cindy made about explaining gaps in your CV, that you are not you're not required. There's no compulsion at all to state what the reasons are for any absences that you may have had. I mean, it could be for, could be any condition. So you don't have to state that. It's more a case of accounting for the gap. So accounting for the gap can really encompass any statement such as that you had to take time off for health reasons, because as is, it's already been intimated very powerfully by Cindy, that this information is in your gift, so that there's no requirement to say what the reason is, just the fact that that you have had to take time out. It could be that you had a period in hospital, for example, or it could be that obviously you just weren't able to continue your studies for that period of time. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Cindy.
No, really, I just agree with all of it.
Okay.
In terms of actual wording, if you need support in terms of actually drafting that, my colleague Sarah has 20+ years of experience of putting that together. She'll be very happy to help you with that. But globally and from a principal perspective and in terms of strategy, that's absolutely right. I agree with everything you say.
Great, thank you. So the next question is there any way to skip out the numerical test stage if you're dyspraxic and really struggling to pass on to that next stage?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what I was talking about, when I referenced the fact that it may be possible to say not just extra time, but that this is an appropriate test. The point about this is that in education, there are very specific limitations. Okay, so extra time is testing a competency. So when you're in education, you're testing a competency in order to be given a qualification. Okay, the reality of numerical tests and all the other tests that generally run with applying to big organisations is that they have been put there because in recent times we see so many applicants to any position that essentially what they're doing is trying to dwindle it down. Those tests do not necessarily relate to whether you are going to be able to do the job itself, and therefore the sort of rights that an employer has to insist that you do those are quite limited. It's not the same as education. So you should look at that as how pertinent is this to the job itself? And we make the argument regularly that it isn't actually pertinent, that all you're doing really here is essentially reducing numbers. If that particular numerical test really doesn't impact your ability to do the job, then there is an argument to be made, and often it's accepted that it should be skipped entirely. So yeah, that is the question. Now, of course, that will depend upon the job itself. So if we're talking about numerical test to be an accountant, then you may have an issue, but everything is about context. But Yes, you can ask for an adjustment on the basis of that, and yes, it can be granted. Again, I suspect you might be in a better position if you're assisted in that negotiation, but yes, absolutely, that is a possibility.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is, someone has just asked if you would mind going over the different times at which you can tell the employer about your disability.
Okay, well, you can tell an employer about your disability anytime you want. So I mean, I categorized it into 4, which was the first being the initial application stage. Thereafter, the test, the assessment center interview, the point at which you're given an offer, or the point at which you're in work. So all of those, depending on your needs and depending on why you're going to be talking about disability, if at all, they're all completely viable. And they're all, it depends on your needs. I think perhaps it might be easiest if whoever asked that question kind of drops me a line afterwards, because it sounds like there's something a little bit more specific behind it, perhaps, and maybe we can give a bit more concrete support to maybe advise on what might be the best time to raise this, and again, depending on the needs of the individual.
Yes, likewise, I'm available for extended appointments. So we have a 60-minute offer, as I said at the beginning. So that's there for a reason, because these things are complex, as we've been able to show you today. So yes, if you wanted to book an appointment, then that would be absolutely fine.
Great, thank you. And the last question to wrap us up is has been asked by a participant: if they need an alternative assessment from recruiters, do they have to say what types of assessment would be a good alternative?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Jenny? I didn't hear everything in the question.
Yeah, sure. So the question is, if I need an alternative assessment from recruiters, do I have to say what types of assessments would be good alternatives?
Well, you don't have to, but of course it goes back to the point of informing them about what you need. So if you know what it is you need, then tell them. And then you've put the onus on them to come up with a good reason not to provide that. These are recruiters, okay? So for the most part, they may or may not have come across your disability. They definitely haven't come across you. So the more information you give them, the more in control you are, telling them what it is you need, the better that is for you. If you don't know what that is, then again, my colleagues are available to help you with that. But no, there's no requirement of any description upon you. This is the onus lies upon the employer, essentially. Okay, so you need to get whatever it is you need to get, however you need to get it. And
it's not your responsibility to source to source assessments. That the responsibility is on the employer for that.
So unless it's in your interest, obviously, and at that point, if it's like this is what you need and you know that's what you need, then ask for it. But don't let them throw the onus back on you. I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make. Would you agree, Delia?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's the end of our questions. So I just wanted to run through the last slides. But I haven't got a great deal of time, but I have got, obviously this is on the handout. So there's some examples there of how you can potentially research an employer's disability record. So, for example, are they members of the Business Disability Forum? Are they signed up as leaders on the Disability Confident programme? So they're just a couple of examples there. If an employer is on the Disability Confident scheme, then again, very often you are able to skip the first set of tests and go straight to interview if you meet the requirements for the role. So I've got one thing I do really want to say about that, is that we we know obviously that things can and do go wrong sometimes in these processes. So just be aware to make sure that in your application you are as thorough as you possibly can in terms of making sure that you meet the entry criteria for that role. Okay, so moving on. So I'm having a few difficulties with moving slides on.
Interject very, very briefly there to say that we at Employability are now running essentially a scheme which is next generation inclusive thinkers with some employer partners, and if they have received our training and we have carried out an audit and they meet our standards, then we give them essentially a stamp of approval, which is an extremely high bar, and that we consider that those employers go above and beyond what is required, and that they're really in the next generation of best practice, really going beyond what's required by law. And you can find a list of those on our website.
That's really good to know, and I think it's important to note as well that just because an organisation isn't necessarily signed up onto those lists, that they are a bad employer. So don't make assumptions either. Sometimes there's a cost attached to these programs, and there may be smaller organisations, smaller businesses who don't have the funds for that, but they are certainly very hot on this agenda and are keen. So again, don't make assumptions and just have those conversations.
And sometimes they actually simply aren't in possession of the information, and when you approach them and tell them about it, they're very open to it. So yeah, just keep an open mind and give them a chance, I suppose, as we're asking them to give candidates a chance.
Okay, so we're out of time now. Apologies, I'm not quite sure why my slides aren't moving on, but there aren't many left. There's a couple of pages around resources for disabled students and graduates, and employability is on there amongst other organisations. So you'll be able to view those when you get the handouts out. So there's things like Disability Rights UK. There's some excellent resources on there. So do take a look at those. And then finally, on the last one page, we've got a link to our pages on our website. There's a QR code on there. Well, there was before I couldn't move it. And there's a downloadable guide on there all about the issues that we've been talking about today, including pros and cons of disclosure. So those pages are there for you to view, and any events and vacancies are posted on there as well. So I think just to finish, I just want to thank you all for attending, and thank you for your questions. It is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube soon. And just a couple of final thoughts. I just wanted to make sure that you know that the Careers Service is here to help you also for 2 years after you graduate, in case you aren't aware of that. So you can use us at any point up to that 2-year point. So I hope that you find that helpful to know. Okay, as I say, thanks very much for joining us today. Many thanks to Cindy McAllister from Employability and to my colleague Jenny Sloan as well for fielding the questions. I hope that you found it helpful, and please do drop us a line. You can book an appointment, or as Cindy has stated helpfully, that they can offer free advice and do that all the time, and will advocate on your behalf. So I really hope that you can use Employability services as well as our own.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.